The Middle Ages unfolded as a world of castles, cathedrals, and kingdoms, where life was often marked by war, feudal duties, and the heavy hand of religion. Yet even within such a strict society, people longed for laughter, music, and poetry to lift their hearts above the hardships of daily life. Entertainment, though different from what we know today, became a vital thread woven into the fabric of medieval culture. It did not rise all at once but grew slowly, shaped by wandering musicians, witty fools, and poetic dreamers who carved their place in the courts and villages of Europe. This was the world from which the jesters, minstrels, and troubadours emerged, the true pioneers of the Middle Ages entertainment industry. In the early centuries after the fall of Rome, Europe struggled through chaos and rebuilding. Noble courts and church leaders sought ways to affirm their power, not only through swords and sermons, but also through culture. Musicians began to travel from place to place, bringing with them not just melodies, but also news, legends, and tales of faraway lands. These wandering performers were welcomed for their ability to turn gatherings into moments of joy. At first, they were simple entertainers with rustic instruments, singing in marketplaces and taverns. But over time, their role grew more important, as lords and kings began to invite them into grand halls. The jester, however, was a different figure altogether. He was not a simple musician, but a master of wit, jokes, riddles, and physical comedy. Dressed in brightly colored clothes with bells upon his cap, he was both amusing and dangerous, for his humor could expose the truth that others dared not speak. The jester's words, hidden beneath layers of laughter, sometimes revealed political criticisms or mocked noble pride. In this way, he became more than a clown. He was a mirror held up to the court, one who could tell truths disguised as jokes, while common folk laughed at his antics. Rulers often listened carefully, for behind the fool's grin there was often wisdom. Minstrels filled yet another role. Unlike the jester, who thrived on laughter, minstrels dedicated themselves to music. They played harps, lutes, flutes, and drums, creating melodies that could make hearts dance or weep. Some minstrels belonged to the courts, serving nobles directly, while others wandered from village to village, earning coins and bread in exchange for songs. They preserved oral tradition, keeping alive the great epics and legends that were passed down from generation to generation. Through their voices, the tales of heroes like Charlemagne and Arthur spread across lands where most people could not read or write. Then came the troubadours, poets and songsmiths who shaped the culture of love, honor, and chivalry. Unlike minstrels, whose songs could be about anything from battles to harvests, troubadours focused on refined themes, courtly love, noble virtues, and the mysteries of the human heart. Their verses elevated music into poetry, turning performance into art that could stir both passion and philosophy. In courts of southern France, troubadours were honored as creators of beauty, admired not only for their skill, but also for their ability to capture the very essence of medieval ideals. Together, these three figures, jester, minstrel, and troubadour, formed the pillars of medieval entertainment. They represented laughter, music, and poetry, each speaking to different needs of the human spirit. Lords welcomed them to banquets to break the monotony of political life. Peasants gathered around them in marketplaces to escape the grind of labor, and even kings found in them a way to display their culture and power. They transformed cold stone halls into places of color, sound, and story. But their lives were not always secure. Minstrels and troubadours wandered dangerous roads, facing hunger, robbers, and suspicion. Jesters, though protected within courts, lived under the gaze of nobles who could at any moment tire of their jokes. Yet despite these risks they endured, for theirs was not merely a profession, but a calling, the calling to entertain, to comfort, and to remind all of society that life was more than toil and battle. As the centuries passed, their influence only deepened. From small villages to the grandest courts of Europe, the sound of lutes, the clever rhymes of poetry, and the mischievous laughter of fools echoed in stone halls and open fields. The Middle Ages may have been an era of struggle, but it was also one of imagination, and without its entertainers, history would have been far grimmer. Thus, the stage was set for a flourishing culture of performance. Chapter by chapter we will journey Through this fascinating world exploring the rise of jesters, the songs of minstrels, and the passion of troubadours, uncovering how these figures built the entertainment industry of the Middle Ages and left a legacy that echoes even into our own time. The jester stood out in medieval courts like a flame in the cold shadows of stone walls. His bright motley costume, adorned with mismatched patterns and tiny bells, made him instantly recognizable. He was a fool by title, but never to be underestimated. In a world where noblemen ruled with iron fists and peasants bent under the weight of taxes, the jester had the rare freedom to speak the unspeakable. He could mock a king to his face, tease knights for their failures, and even question the church, all while pretending it was nothing more than a joke. This unique privilege made the jester both beloved and feared, a creature living on the razor's edge between laughter and danger. The life of a jester was not easy to win. Unlike minstrels, who could learn instruments, or troubadours, who could study poetry, the jester's art came from instinct. One could not simply be trained to be funny. The gift had to be natural. A successful jester needed quick wit, a sharp tongue, and often a clever mind hidden beneath his painted face. Many began as peasants entertaining their villages with mimicry or tricks. Some were noticed by traveling lords who invited them into their households. Once in the courts, however, the stakes became far higher. For a poorly timed jest or a joke that insulted the wrong person could end in dismissal or worse. The jester's performances were not limited to jokes. He juggled balls, knives, and even torches, creating spectacles that dazzled noble guests. He danced and tumbled with acrobatic skill, mocking knights by imitating their clumsy armor or ridiculing the stiff manners of court officials. Sometimes he brought trained animals to add to his show, making a monkey wear a knight's helmet or teaching a dog to bow like a courtier. His humor could be silly and physical, but beneath the laughter there was always something sharper. Many jesters crafted riddles filled with hidden messages, poking at political scandals or whispering truths disguised as nonsense. What made the jester truly powerful was his role as the licensed fool in courts where words could cost lives. He alone was granted freedom of speech. A nobleman could be punished for criticizing the king, but a jester could say the very same thing while ringing his bells and pulling a face, and the court would roar with laughter. Kings themselves often relied on jesters to tell them what others dared not. A wise monarch listened carefully, for within the fool's comedy was often the purest honesty. Some rulers even valued their jesters as advisors, trusting their unfiltered words more than the flattery of courtiers. Yet this freedom was fragile. A jester who went too far, who insulted too deeply, or who angered the wrong person could find himself cast out into the streets. The same laughter that once protected him could quickly turn into scorn. His life was always uncertain, balancing between humor and humiliation, privilege and poverty. Many jesters spent their final years wandering from town to town, reduced to street performers begging for coins. Others, however, were remembered with honor, buried in noble lands as companions of kings. Beyond the courts, jesters often performed for common folk. At festivals, fairs, and carnivals, they became the heart of celebration. Here their comedy was freer, unrestrained by court etiquette. They mocked not only lords but also peasants themselves, playing on the familiar troubles of daily life, hard work, greedy landlords, and troublesome neighbors. Crowds loved them, for jesters turned hardship into laughter, reminding everyone that even in suffering there was joy to be found. Some jesters even recorded their jokes in manuscripts, passing on riddles and verses that have survived through centuries. These writings reveal their intelligence, for they were not mere clowns but wordsmiths who understood rhythm, irony, and satire. Their craft influenced later forms of comedy, from plays to satirical literature, proving that the fool's art was more than entertainment, it was a cultural force. In the grand halls of medieval Europe, the jester's laughter echoed against stone walls, softening the harshness of politics and war. He was both outsider and insider, mocked and respected, fragile yet enduring. His bells jingled not only for amusement, but also for truth, reminding kings and peasants alike that behind the pomp and power of the Middle Ages, life needed humor to survive. Thus, the jester carved his place in history not as a fool to be dismissed, but as one of the earliest professionals in the entertainment industry. His legacy remains, for even today comedians carry his torch, standing on stages with the same daring courage, speaking truth through laughter. The fool of the Middle Ages was never truly a fool. He was the clever voice of humanity, disguised in motley clothes. If the jester was the heart of laughter in the Middle Ages, then the minstrel was the voice of music and memory. In a time when books were rare and literacy was the privilege of the few, the minstrel carried the weight of stories across kingdoms. With a harp in hand or a lute slung over his shoulder, he wandered from castle halls to village squares, breathing life into the past through melody and verse. He was not just a musician, but also a historian, a storyteller, and a keeper of tradition, turning events into songs that echoed long after battles were fought and heroes passed into legend. The minstrel's world was shaped by sound. His tools were as diverse as the cultures of medieval Europe. In northern lands, he plucked the harp's golden strings in southern courts. He strummed the lute with delicate precision in bustling marketplaces. He blew lively tunes upon flutes or tapped rhythms on drums. Each instrument carried not only notes, but also emotions: joy, sorrow, triumph, or longing. To hear a minstrel play was to be carried away from the ordinary struggles of life into a realm of story, song, and imagination. Many minstrels were wanderers, moving constantly in search of patrons. Their lives on the road were both adventurous and dangerous. Traveling alone or in small groups, they crossed forests, rivers, and treacherous paths, facing robbers and hunger. Yet the promise of reward kept them moving. A noble lord might grant a minstrel coin, clothing, or even a place at his table in exchange for a night of songs. In villages, common folk gave bread or shelter to those who could brighten their evenings with tales of distant wars or songs of love. The minstrel's voice was his passport, opening doors wherever melody could reach. Not all minstrels wandered. However, some earned stable positions in royal courts. These courtly minstrels became official musicians, performing at feasts, tournaments, and weddings. They learned to play in harmony with other musicians, creating grand spectacles of sound that accompanied the pomp of noble life. At such events, their music was more than entertainment. It was a symbol of power. A king's court filled with minstrels demonstrated wealth, culture, and refinement. To employ skilled musicians was to prove superiority over rival lords whose halls echoed with silence. But whether free or bound to a court, the minstrel's art remained rooted in storytelling. He sang of legendary heroes like Roland, whose courage inspired warriors, and of tragic lovers whose fates stirred the hearts of listeners through his songs. Ancient myths survived, bridging the gap between past and present. He also served as a living messenger, spreading news from one region to another, long before printing presses or newspapers. It was the minstrel who told villagers about the outcome of wars, the coronation of kings, or the fall of castles in his verses. History was shaped into narrative and truth mingled with imagination. Life as a minstrel was not free of struggle. Their wandering nature often placed them on the margins of society. Some churchmen distrusted them, accusing them of spreading worldly distractions and immoral songs. At times, they were treated with suspicion, seen as beggars or tricksters who lived without honest labor. Yet their presence was too valuable to be dismissed. Even monks who criticized them often found themselves humming their tunes in secret, proof of how deeply their melodies touched the human spirit. The minstrels' songs were also windows into the hearts of the people. While troubadours wrote refined poetry for noble audiences, minstrels often sang of themes closer to daily life: harvests, dances, love found and lost, victories celebrated and sorrows endured. Their music carried laughter to peasants weary from toil and gave courage to soldiers marching into battle. In this way, minstrels bound together communities, offering comfort, joy, and unity in a divided world. Some minstrels achieved fame, their names remembered far beyond their lifetimes. Others vanished into obscurity, their voices swallowed by time. But collectively, they created a vast tradition that shaped medieval culture. Without them, much of Europe's oral heritage would have been lost. They were not simply performers, but guardians of memory, shaping the way history was remembered through song. As the centuries passed, their role evolved. The wandering minstrels gave way. to organized groups of musicians who trained in guilds, gaining recognition as professionals. Yet the spirit of the minstrel remained the spirit of the traveling artist, who used music to bridge worlds, to carry joy and sorrow alike, to keep alive the voices of the past, while giving hope to the present. Thus, in the tapestry of medieval entertainment, the minstrel stood as the bearer of song and story. His music lingered in the air long after his footsteps faded, leaving behind an invisible but powerful legacy. And though centuries have passed, the echo of his harp, the rise of his voice, and the tales he carried still remind us that in the Middle Ages song was not only amusement, but the very breath of culture itself. If jesters made men laugh and minstrels carried the memory of nations through song, the troubadours gave the Middle Ages its soul. They were poets, dreamers, and singers of refined verses, born in the courts of southern France during the 11th century. Unlike the rustic minstrels who often sang of daily struggles, troubadours dedicated themselves to ideals, honor, virtue, loyalty, and above all, love. Their art was not simply entertainment. It was philosophy wrapped in melody, a vision of how noble hearts ought to live. Through their words, the culture of courtly love took root, transforming medieval Europe. As understanding of romance and shaping the very language of poetry for centuries to come. The troubadour's life was one of elegance and creativity. Many were themselves nobles or educated men, unlike minstrels who often came from humbler origins. Some troubadours were knights who laid down their swords to take up the lute, their verses flowing with both the strength of warriors and the tenderness of lovers. They composed in the Occitan language of southern France, a tongue filled with music and rhythm. Perfect for poetry, their works were carefully crafted, blending complex rhyme schemes with themes of longing, loyalty, and devotion. To hear a troubadour perform was to be swept into a world where love was not a simple passion, but a noble code, a force that demanded sacrifice, purity, and honor. Courtly love was the foundation of their art. In this tradition, a knight might dedicate his service to a lady of higher rank, swearing to uphold her honor and obey her commands, even if their love could never be fully realized. Troubadours turned these ideals into song, painting love as both joy and suffering, both blessing and torment. The unattainable lady became a symbol of perfection, and a troubadour's longing for her was a metaphor for the human soul, yearning for beauty and virtue. This vision enchanted medieval courts, giving birth to an atmosphere where poetry was not just art, but a way of life. Their performances were intimate and refined. Troubadours sang in noble halls, accompanied by a lute or a small harp, their voices soft and deliberate. Unlike jesters who brought loud laughter, or minstrels who entertained crowds, troubadours performed for smaller, more selective audiences. Their listeners were lords, ladies, and courtiers who understood the subtlety of their words. A single verse could ignite whispers of admiration, for their art was seen as a mark of culture and refinement. To host troubadours was to show one's court as enlightened and sophisticated. But troubadours were more than entertainers, they were innovators. They pioneered the art of lyric poetry in Europe, crafting forms that later influenced Italian poets like Dante and Petrarch, and eventually shaped the sonnets of the Renaissance. Their emphasis on personal expression, emotion, and idealized love marked a turning point in Western literature. Before them, much poetry focused on epic battles, saints' lives, or biblical themes. After them, poetry found a new home in the human heart. Life as a troubadour was not without struggle. Though many came from noble birth, others were dependent on patrons. They relied on the generosity of lords and ladies who rewarded them with gifts, hospitality, or protection. Political turmoil often forced them to wander, carrying their songs from court to court. Wars, rivalries, and the rise of strict church authority sometimes silenced their voices. For the church disapproved of songs that celebrated earthly love over spiritual devotion. Yet their art proved resilient, spreading beyond France into Spain, Italy, and Germany, where they inspired local traditions of poet-singers such as the Minnesänger. The themes of troubadour poetry went beyond love. Some wrote of politics, weaving satire into their verses. Others praised virtues like loyalty, bravery, or humility. Yet love remained their most enduring subject. not as a fleeting desire, but as a sacred bond that ennobled both man and woman. Their words lifted romance from the physical into the spiritual, transforming it into a code that shaped medieval manners, and even influenced the behavior of knights and nobles. The image of the troubadour became iconic, a noble figure in fine robes, lute in hand, his gaze lifted toward the heavens as he sang of a lady beyond his reach. He was a symbol of aspiration, of the human longing for something greater than oneself. Though centuries have passed, echoes of their influence remain in modern poetry, music, and even the way we imagine romance. The troubadour's legacy is that he gave voice to the heart, in an age often ruled by steel and stone. In the great story of medieval entertainment, the troubadours stand as its philosophers, turning art into ideals and music into meaning. They did not make men laugh like jesters nor spread news like minstrels. They gave them dreams, visions of beauty that transcended the harsh realities of medieval life. Their songs were the flowers that bloomed in the gardens of castles, fragile yet eternal, their fragrance carried across centuries. The Middle Ages were not only a time of courts and castles, but also of bustling fairs, colourful festivals and sacred gatherings where laughter, music, and poetry spilled into the open air. If the jester, minstrel, and troubadour found patrons in noble halls, they also found eager audiences among the common people during these lively events. For in a world ruled by toil, hunger, and feudal obligations, festivals became rare moments of joy, moments when the weight of survival could be lifted by the power of entertainment. The medieval calendar was punctuated by festivals tied to both religion and the seasons. Easter, Christmas, and saints' feast days brought processions, church rituals, and gatherings where villagers celebrated with dances, games, and music. Pagan traditions survived too, disguised within Christian celebrations, giving rise to harvest festivals, May Day dances, and midsummer fires. At such events, entertainers found their stage. The laughter of the jester, the songs of the minstrel, and the refined verses of the troubadour mixed with the noise of crowds, the smell of roasted meat, and the bright colors of banners and costumes. Fairs were even grander, often held near towns or abbeys. They drew merchants from across regions, filling the streets with stalls of cloth, spices, tools, and trinkets. Amid this whirlwind of trade, entertainers became the living spirit of the fair. Jesters juggled before audiences who tossed them coins. Minstrels played lively tunes to draw crowds around merchant stalls, and troubadours sometimes found wealthy patrons among the noble visitors. The fair was both marketplace and theatre, where commerce and culture mingled beneath the open sky. Public squares turned into stages. A jester might climb onto a barrel and perform tricks, making peasants roar with laughter at his imitations of greedy landlords or pompous priests. A minstrel, seated with a harp, drew listeners close with tales of knights and battles, his voice rising above the hum of the crowd. Troubadours, though less common in such noisy places, sometimes used fairs to spread their poetry, hoping to catch the ear of a wandering noble who might invite them to court. Each performer carved a space for himself, turning the chaos of the marketplace into moments of enchantment. Festivals also included dramatic performances. The early seeds of theatre in Europe were planted during these gatherings, when churchmen staged morality plays or biblical scenes in public squares. At first religious in nature, these plays gradually became more humorous and worldly, with jesters and wandering actors adding comic interludes. This fusion of sacred and secular gave birth to medieval theatre, where entertainment became both instruction and amusement. Music and dance filled the festivals with rhythm. Minstrels played lively tunes as peasants fawned, circles and danced upon the grass. The stomping of feet, the clapping of hands, and the sound of pipes and drums created an atmosphere of unity where differences of class seemed, for a brief moment, to dissolve. Lords and peasants alike could join in merriment, though each celebrated in their own fashion. Nobles in decorated halls, villagers in open fields. Still, the music bound them together, proving that joy was a language understood by all. The church's role in these gatherings was complex. On one hand, it sponsored many festivals, recognizing that celebration was part of the human spirit. On the other, it often frowned upon the unruly laughter, of jesters, the romantic songs of troubadours, or the bawdy tunes of minstrels. Yet even stern priests could not fully silence entertainment, for the people demanded it, and without it, festivals would lose their heart. Thus, entertainers thrived in a delicate balance, sometimes welcomed, sometimes condemned, but always present. Beyond joy, festivals also offered opportunity. Wandering entertainers relied on such gatherings to survive, earning coins, food, or even invitations to noble households. Many formed partnerships, joining troupes that travelled together for safety and spectacle. A fair might host not only jesters and musicians, but also acrobats, dancers, puppeteers, and animal trainers, turning the event into a true carnival of sights and sounds. The medieval fair was, in many ways, the birthplace of the entertainment industry, a place where talent met audience in the open marketplace of joy. The memory of these gatherings lingered long after the banners were taken down. Villagers returned to their fields with songs echoing in their minds. Nobles rode back to their castles carrying verses of love, and merchants recalled the laughter of jesters that lightened the long hours of trade. Entertainment was not a distraction but a necessity, giving meaning to the rhythm of life, marking the seasons not only with labor and prayer but with laughter, music, and dreams. Thus, festivals and fairs became the great stage of medieval Europe, where the entertainers of the age proved their worth before crowds of every rank. Here, beneath the open sky and among the bustle of humanity, the jester's wit, the minstrel's song, and the troubadour's poetry found their truest home, not confined within stone walls but alive in the hearts of people. In these gatherings, the entertainment industry of the Middle Ages revealed its greatest power, the ability to bring communities together, to turn hardship into celebration, and to remind all that joy was as vital as bread and faith. While the laughter of fairs and festivals gave entertainers their public stage, the true heart of medieval performance often beat within the courts of kings, queens, and nobles. Castles were not only fortresses of power, but also theatres of prestige, where rulers displayed wealth, culture, and refinement. To fill their halls with song, wit, and poetry was to prove superiority over rivals, and thus the patronage of jesters, minstrels, and troubadours became a mark of nobility. In these stone walls, entertainment was transformed from a wandering art into an institution of influence. The medieval court was a place of ceremony and spectacle. Banquets were lavish affairs where dozens of courses were served, goblets of wine flowed, and the flicker of torchlight danced upon gilded tapestries. Yet food alone did not impress guests. Music, laughter, and poetic performance were as essential as fine dishes lords and ladies expected to be delighted between courses, and so entertainers took the stage. A minstrel might pluck his harp as servants carried roasted boar into the hall. A troubadour might recite verses of chivalry as knights boasted of their deeds. A jester might tumble across the floor, juggling apples from the feast, turning solemn banquets into evenings of joy for nobles. Entertainers were more than amusement, they were symbols of prestige. To employ skilled musicians or witty jesters was to declare one's court a place of refinement. When rival lords visited, the quality of entertainment revealed much about the wealth and taste of their host. A king with a brilliant jester and a chorus of minstrels seemed cultured and powerful, while one with silence in his halls seemed poor in both spirit and treasure. Thus, entertainers became tools of political image, woven into the fabric of noble identity. Patronage provided stability for many artists. Wandering minstrels who once lived on uncertain coins could find steady employment under a lord's service. Troubadours, whose refined art required concentration, often depended on noble patrons to provide the resources and audiences they needed. Jesters, though less formal, often became trusted companions of kings, valued not only for their humor, but also for their courage in speaking uncomfortable truths. In return, patrons offered clothing, food, and even housing, making courtly life a haven for those fortunate enough to secure it. The relationship between entertainer and patron, however, was complex. A jester might enjoy the freedom to mock his master, but he also lived under his master's will. A single word of displeasure could mean dismissal. Minstrels and troubadours, too, were bound by loyalty. often composing songs that praised their patrons' virtues or mocked their enemies. In this way, art became a political weapon, shaping public opinion and spreading noble reputation through verse. To praise a lord in song was to make his name echo beyond his lands. To ridicule him was to stain his honor. Courts also became centers of artistic exchange. Entertainers from distant lands were often welcomed, bringing new instruments, melodies, and ideas. An English court might host a Spanish minstrel, introducing Moorish influences into northern music. A French troubadour might journey into Italy, inspiring poets with his verses of love. In this cultural crossroads, the entertainment industry grew richer, absorbing diversity and spreading innovation across Europe. Noble women played a significant role. In this culture, many were patrons themselves, supporting troubadours who sang in their honor. Some women even composed poetry, joining the tradition of song with their own voices. The presence of ladies in court gave rise to the ideals of courtly love, where knights and troubadours are alike dedicated there. Service to noble women, elevating romance into an art form. Without their influence, the culture of refinement that defined medieval courts would have been far poorer. Despite the grandeur, entertainers in courts still lived precariously. Their fate depended on the mood of their patrons and the shifting tides of politics. A minstrel might be celebrated one day and cast out the next if his song displeased his lord. A jester might be loved for his daring wit, but punished for a joke that struck too deeply. Troubadours, caught in the intrigues of noble romance, sometimes faced scandal or exile. The court offered wealth and prestige, but always at a cost. Yet for all its risks, the court was the pinnacle of medieval entertainment. Here entertainers refined their craft, gained recognition, and left behind legacies recorded in manuscripts and chronicles. The laughter of a king, the tears of a lady moved by song. The applause of guests at a banquet, these were the rewards that transformed wandering artists into figures of history. Thus, in the great halls of lords and kings, the jester, minstrel, and troubadour reached their highest stage. Supported by patronage, yet bound by duty, they became essential to the life of the court, turning stone walls into theaters of laughter, music, and poetry. Their presence proved that even in the most powerful chambers of the Middle Ages, rulers needed not only soldiers and priests, but also the voices of entertainers to remind them of their humanity. The medieval church stood as the most powerful institution of the Middle Ages, guiding kings, shaping laws and defining morality. Its influence reached into every corner of life, and so it inevitably came into conflict with the world of jesters, minstrels, and troubadours. For while the church called men and women toward prayer, sacrifice, and spiritual purity, entertainers called them toward laughter, song, and earthly joys. Between these two forces, tension constantly simmered, sometimes erupting into condemnation, other times blending into uneasy coexistence. Priests and bishops often criticized entertainers for leading people astray. Jesters mocked authority, sometimes even the clergy, with jokes that bordered on blasphemy. Minstrels filled villages with songs of battles and romances rather than psalms, while troubadours sang boldly of earthly love instead of divine devotion. To church leaders, these performances were distractions from faith, sparks of temptation that threatened to draw souls away from God. In sermons and writings, entertainers were sometimes denounced as sinful wanderers, accused of spreading immorality, drunkenness, and disorder. Yet the church could not entirely silence them. The people demanded joy, and the rhythms of daily life required moments of celebration. Festivals, tied to the Christian calendar, became places where entertainers thrived. At Christmas or Easter gatherings, minstrels played their instruments, jesters performed tricks, and troubadours recited verses, blending sacred and secular together. Even morality plays, originally staged by the church to teach biblical lessons, eventually absorbed comic interludes and lively songs to keep audiences entertained. The church, despite its disapproval, learned that without laughter and music, its teachings often failed to hold the people's attention. Some clergy even embraced entertainers. Monasteries occasionally welcomed minstrels to perform at feasts. Certain abbots employed jesters for amusement, just as nobles did. Troubadours found inspiration in religious themes, writing verses that blended divine love with human longing. This uneasy mix created a paradox. The church condemned entertainment as worldly, yet it also used its power when convenient, recognizing its ability to move hearts and spread messages. The tension was especially sharp with the Troubadours. Their doctrine of courtly love often clashed with Christian teachings about marriage and chastity. Songs that celebrated passion, longing, or forbidden love were seen as threats to moral order. Yet even critics admitted the beauty of their verses. Some churchmen secretly admired their art, while others attempted to redirect it by encouraging songs that praised the Virgin Mary instead of earthly women, turning romantic devotion into spiritual worship. Despite conflicts, entertainers shaped religious culture as much as religion shaped theirs. Pilgrimages, which drew thousands of travelers to holy shrines, became major stages for minstrels and jesters. Along pilgrimage routes, music and storytelling flourished, providing weary travelers with comfort and distraction. In this way, even acts of devotion became intertwined with entertainment, showing that faith and joy were not always separate but often walked hand in hand. The church also indirectly strengthened the entertainers by preserving music and manuscripts. Monks who copied texts sometimes included secular songs alongside hymns, ensuring their survival. Instruments used in sacred services, such as organs and harps, inspired the tools of minstrels. Though official doctrine frowned upon worldly entertainment, the church's influence allowed its art to endure. Ultimately, the relationship between the church and entertainers was one of contradiction, condemnation, and dependence, suspicion, and fascination. The clergy could scold jesters for mocking authority, yet still laugh at their jokes in private. They could dismiss minstrels as frivolous, yet still welcome their songs at feasts. They could denounce troubadours for their love poetry, yet still be moved by the beauty of their verses. Entertainment survived because it fed a hunger the church could not satisfy alone. The hunger for joy, for laughter, for beauty in the midst of hardship. Thus, in the shadow of cathedrals and beneath the gaze of priests, the jester's bells still rang, the minstrel's harp still sang, and the troubadour's poetry still soared. The church, though powerful, could not silence the human spirit's need for art. And so, through conflict and compromise, both faith and entertainment shaped the culture of the Middle Ages, each reminding the other that man lives not by bread or prayer alone, but also by laughter, music, and the poetry of the heart. As the Middle Ages advanced, the wandering lives of jesters, minstrels, and troubadours slowly began to shift toward greater organization. What had once been a loose patchwork of performers, roaming from castle to castle or village to village, gradually grew into a more structured profession. The forces that shaped medieval Europe economic growth, urbanization, and the rising influence of guilds did not leave the entertainers untouched. In time, they too began to seek brotherhoods and protections, binding themselves under rules that mirrored the craftsmen, merchants, and artisans of their age. The minstrel was perhaps the first to find a place within this new order. Their art, centered on music, lent itself naturally to apprenticeships, mastery, and shared traditions. In bustling towns, especially in France, England, and the German lands, associations of musicians emerged. These guilds acted not only as networks for training, but also as guardians of quality. To call oneself a minstrel in certain cities meant belonging to a fraternity that enforced standards and ensured that performances upheld a certain dignity. Just as blacksmiths and masons protected their crafts, minstrels guarded the reputation of their art. In Paris, London, and Cologne, municipal records reveal traces of such organizations. Some were tightly bound to civic duties. Minstrels might be expected to perform at public ceremonies, fairs, or processions, ensuring that music remained woven into the life of the community. Membership in these guilds offered performers both privileges and obligations. They might be exempt from certain taxes, receive legal protections, or gain access to training. But they were also required to pay dues, maintain discipline, and uphold the honor of their profession. The jester, more anarchic by nature, did not fit so easily into these structures. Their role as tricksters and fools meant that their work thrived in spontaneity, mockery, and unpredictability. Yet even jesters found ways to connect with one another, forming loose brotherhoods or identifying themselves through symbolic clothing. While not as formally recognized as the minstrels' guilds, there were networks of fools who shared knowledge, costumes, and even apprenticeships, ensuring that the art of laughter passed from one generation to the next. The troubadours, on the other hand, belonged less to guilds and more to courts. Their ties to noble patrons meant that their organization was shaped by aristocratic culture rather than civic authority. Yet troubadour schools, where younger poets and singers learned the conventions of verse, mirrored the guild model in spirit if not in form. In southern France, the Consistory Delgay Sabre Poetic Academy established in Toulouse created formal competitions for poetry with judges, prizes and rules, effectively professionalizing the art of courtly song. The rise of guilds and organized associations elevated entertainers from wandering vagabonds to recognized members of society. Townspeople no longer saw minstrels merely as drifters but as craftsmen of sound, essential to civic pride and culture. Jesters, though still viewed with suspicion, carved out a space as essential voices of satire, tolerated for their wit. Troubadours, with their academies and noble patrons, gained reputations not merely as performers but as artists, shaping taste and language itself. This shift also gave entertainers economic stability. Where once they relied on unpredictable gifts of bread, coins, or shelter, now they could demand payments set by custom. Guilds negotiated wages for public performances, ensuring that minstrels were not cheated. Troubadour contests offered rewards of gold or fine garments. Even jesters, tied to households, could secure lifetime positions as retainers, receiving steady income along with food and clothing. Yet with recognition came restrictions, just as guilds limited competition among craftsmen. So, did entertainers' associations guard against outsiders? A musician who attempted to perform without guild membership might be fined or banned from playing in a town. Jesters who mocked beyond permitted limits risked punishment, even exile. Troubadours whose verses offended noble patrons could lose support overnight. In this way, the very structures that gave entertainers protection also bound them with rules, curbing their freedom in exchange for status. The professionalization of entertainers mirrored the broader transformation of medieval Europe. As cities grew, as trade flourished, and as society became more complex, the old wandering ways of a loosely connected world gave way to systems of order. Entertainment was no longer merely the spontaneous outpouring of song, laughter, and rhyme. It was a craft, a discipline, a recognized trade within the fabric of medieval life. By the close of the 13th century, jesters, minstrels, and troubadours stood at a crossroads. They were still rooted in the free, joyous traditions of laughter and music, but they were also increasingly bound by contracts, patrons, and institutions. This duality, freedom and order, spontaneity and discipline, became the defining mark of their profession. The bells of the jester still jingled, the harp of the minstrel still rang, and the verses of the troubadour still soared. But behind each sound lay the quiet weight of guild halls, courtly academies, and the slow march of organization that shaped medieval Europe into a more structured world. If the castle and the court were the stages of the nobles, and the tavern the stage of the common folk, then the festival was the great theatre of the Middle Ages where all classes met, and entertainment became the heartbeat of community life. Festivals and fairs were the times when jesters, minstrels, and troubadours found their widest audiences, transforming ordinary fields and market squares into arenas of laughter, music, and spectacle. The medieval calendar was thick with feast days, many tied to the church, others to seasonal cycles. Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost were not only religious solemnities, but also occasions of joy and performance. Harvest festivals marked the turning of the seasons with song and merriment. Local saints' days filled towns with parades, banners, and music. And above all stood the great fairs, gatherings of merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and pilgrims, which became the greatest marketplaces for both goods and culture. Into these bustling events came the entertainers. Jesters thrived in the chaos of fairs, slipping between stalls, performing tricks for laughing children and mocking greedy merchants. Their antics broke down the barriers of class. Even the poorest peasant could laugh at a fool's sharp wit. and even a wealthy noble might pause to hear a clever jest. The bells of their costumes jingled like coins dropped in a hat, each sound a reminder that laughter was as valuable as bread. Minstrels found in festivals the perfect stage for their music. They carried harps, fiddles, and flutes, filling the air with melodies that wove themselves into the fabric of the crowd. Their songs praised heroes, told of distant lands, or simply set feet dancing on the cobblestones. In the evenings, bonfires lit the squares, and groups gathered as minstrels led choruses, turning strangers into companions through shared rhythm. In fairs that lasted days, their songs became the soundtrack of trade and celebration. Troubadours, too, appeared at festivals, though their presence carried more refinement. They recited poetry in shaded corners of noble pavilions, offering verses that mingled romance and philosophy. Their songs were less about stirring the crowd than about enchanting select groups of listeners. At times, competitions were staged where troubadours tested their wit and skill against one another. Judged by noble ladies or learned clerics, the winners gained prestige, fine gifts, and the admiration of both peers and patrons. The variety of entertainment at festivals was staggering. Alongside jesters, minstrels, and troubadours came acrobats, jugglers, bear trainers, and puppet masters. Together they created a carnival atmosphere, a suspension of ordinary rules, where peasants danced beside lords and laughter echoed louder than the tolling of church bells. For a few precious days, hardship was forgotten. Hunger, toil, and feudal burdens faded into the background, replaced by the universal delight of performance. Fairs, in particular, offered entertainers opportunities not only for fame, but also for livelihood. A clever jester could earn as much in a day as he might in weeks of wandering. Minstrels could sell written copies of their songs, or find employment offers from nobles impressed by their skill. Troubadours could gain patrons, among visiting lords and ladies, securing invitations to distant courts. The mingling of classes at fairs made them fertile ground for advancement, turning chance encounters into lifelong fortunes. Festivals also allowed new ideas and styles of performance to spread. A tune played by a minstrel in Flanders might be carried by another to Italy. A joke born in a German fair might be retold in an English tavern. A troubadour's verse, overheard by a student, might inspire a new poem in a university town. These gatherings acted as crossroads of culture, where local traditions blended with foreign influences, enriching the art of entertainment with every meeting. Yet festivals were not without controversy. The church, while often sponsoring feast days, worried about the excesses they encouraged. Drunkenness, dancing, and bawdy songs clashed with moral teachings. Priests preached against frivolity even as their own parishioners crowded to see the jester tumble, or the minstrel sing. Civic authorities, too, feared disorder. Large crowds could breed quarrels, theft, or rebellion. Thus, entertainers sometimes walked a fine line between joy and danger, their freedom to perform always shadowed by the possibility of censorship or arrest. Despite this, festivals and fairs endured. As the lifeblood of medieval culture, they embodied the people's hunger for joy, for release, for beauty beyond the drudgery of daily life. In those crowded squares, entertainment was not a luxury, it was necessity. As vital to the spirit as bread to the body, jesters, minstrels, and troubadours gave voice to that need, transforming the marketplace into a theatre, the street into a stage, the common man into a king of laughter for a day. And when the festival ended, when the stalls were packed and the fields returned to silence, the memory of music and laughter lingered like the echo of bells across the hills. For in the Middle Ages, festivals were more than gatherings, they were the great pulse of life, and without them, the entertainer's art could not have thrived. The Middle Ages were not a world of permanence, but of change, and as centuries passed, the bright spark of jesters, minstrels, and troubadours began to flicker. The 12th and 13th centuries had been their golden age, when laughter echoed in castles, music filled the markets, and poetry soared in courts. Yet by the 14th and 15th centuries, the world around them was shifting, and with it, their place in society. What once made them essential began to lose its hold, and the proud entertainers of medieval Europe found themselves standing in the shadow of decline. The first shadow came with the changing tastes of the nobility. Troubadours, who once dazzled courts with their songs of love and honor, began to seem outdated. Their verses, steeped in the traditions of courtly love, no longer spoke to an age racked by war, plague, and political turmoil. Nobles grew weary of delicate metaphors and turned instead to practical concerns, alliances, battles, survival. Poetry that once seemed the pinnacle of refinement began to appear frivolous in an age of bloodshed. By the 14th century, troubadours had almost vanished, their songs surviving more in manuscripts than in living voices. Minstrels, too, felt the winds of change. For generations they had carried music through towns and castles. But now new forms of entertainment arose. Professional theatre began to grow, with plays performed by companies that specialized in drama rather than song. Universities fostered scholars who preserved music in written notation, making it possible for trained musicians to learn complex compositions without relying on oral tradition. Slowly, the minstrel's role as a wandering memory keeper diminished, replaced by choirs. Court musicians and scholars who treated music as a learned science, the jester, ever adaptable, survived longer. His wit and humor, his ability to mock without mercy, gave him a place even in declining times. Some rulers still kept fools by their side, valuing their sharp tongues as a counter to flatterers. Yet even jesters faced new challenges. Courts became more formal, etiquette more rigid, and laughter more restrained. Where once the fool's freedom to speak truth through jokes had been celebrated, now it was increasingly curtailed. The jesters' bells jingled still, but their sound was softer, fading into the background of a changing age. The Black Death in the mid-14th century further deepened the entertainer's decline. Villages were emptied, towns were scarred, and festivals that once sustained performers vanished in the shadow of fear. With half of Europe's population gone, there was less appetite for song and laughter and more for survival. Jesters wandered empty streets, minstrels played for dwindling audiences, and troubadours disappeared almost entirely. The plague silenced not only voices but entire traditions. Political centralization also played its part. As monarchies grew stronger, courts became centers of authority, less willing to tolerate the independent voices of wandering entertainers. Kings and queens preferred their own appointed musicians, poets, and jesters. Bound to strict loyalty, the free spirit of the entertainer, who once roamed from patron to patron, was gradually squeezed out by controlled, institutionalized art. What had once been a living, breathing, unpredictable force became formalized, ordered, and restrained. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century dealt another blow. Once, troubadours and minstrels were the keepers of stories and songs, passing them from memory to memory. Now, words could be printed and spread across Europe without their voices. Books replaced wandering, singers as the carriers of knowledge and poetry. Music notation advanced, allowing composers to reach audiences without the minstrel's harp. The old oral tradition, the very lifeblood of the entertainers, was no longer necessary in the same way. Yet decline did not mean disappearance. The essence of the jester, minstrel, and troubadour lived on in new forms. Jesters gave birth to the clowns of later theatre, their spirit carried into carnivals and comedies. Minstrels evolved into trained musicians, their instruments refined into the foundations of modern orchestras. Troubadours inspired later. Poets, their verses remembered as the roots of European lyric tradition. Even as their roles faded, their influence remained, echoing in the culture that succeeded them. Their decline was, in truth, the transformation of entertainment itself. The Middle Ages had been an age of oral song, of laughter shouted in squares, of verses spoken in candlelit halls. The Renaissance that followed would be an age of written literature, professional theatre, and cultivated music. The entertainers who once embodied the free spirit of medieval life were passing the torch to new forms of art. They had played their part, and though their stage was dimming, their legacy would shine for centuries. Thus, the decline of jesters, minstrels, and troubadours was not an end but a turning point. They had brought joy, beauty, and wisdom to an age of hardship, and in their fading, they cleared the way for new expressions of human creativity. Their bells, their harps, and their verses may have grown silent, but their echoes still lingered, carried forward in every play, every song, and every poem that followed. Though the Middle Ages faded into the dawn of the Renaissance, the echoes of its entertainers did not vanish. The jester, the minstrel, and the troubadour had left marks too deep upon the culture of Europe to be forgotten. Their voices, though dimmed, shaped new art, inspired new traditions, and lived on in the very foundations of Western entertainment. What seemed like decline in one age revealed itself as transformation in the next. The jester, with his cap of bells and tongue of fire, lived on in the figure of the clown and the comic actor. In Renaissance courts, fools were still kept, though their roles became more theatrical than anarchic. They no longer mocked kings as boldly as their medieval ancestors had, but their spirit was reborn on stage. Commedia dell'arte in Italy, with its masked characters and quick wit, carried the jester's energy into a new form. Shakespeare's plays, filled with wise fools like Fest and Touchstone, borrowed the medieval fool's trick of speaking truth through jest. The jester's ability to entertain while also revealing uncomfortable truths did not disappear. It matured into theatre, satire, comedy that would flourish for centuries. The minstrel, too, left a powerful inheritance. Though the age of the wandering musician waned, their instruments and traditions seeded the music of the Renaissance. The lute, harp, and fiddle, once strummed by minstrels in taverns and squares, became refined in the hands of court musicians and composers. Polyphonic music, sung by choirs in cathedrals and courts, owed something to the wandering singers who had once woven melody into daily life. Even the ballad form, still sung today, was born of the minstrel's craft. Simple verses that told stories of love, war, or tragedy, passed down through generations long after the minstrels themselves had disappeared. The troubadour's legacy was perhaps the most enduring of all. Their poetry laid the foundations of European lyric tradition, influencing writers from Dante to Petrarch. The very idea of poetry as a personal expression of love, longing, and devotion grew from the troubadour's verses sung in candlelit courts of Provence. When Petrarch wrote his sonnets to Laura, he echoed the troubadour's ideal of unattainable love. When Renaissance poets explored passion and desire, they were walking paths first paved by those medieval singers who turned romance into art. Even modern conceptions of romantic love, celebrated in song and story, bear the imprint of the troubadour's voice. Beyond individual legacies, the entertainers of the Middle Ages created the very idea of performance as a profession. Before them, art was communal, anonymous, tied to ritual or survival. With jesters, minstrels, and troubadours, art became a craft, a calling, a career. They lived from their voices, their jokes, their songs, and in doing so they carved out the space for later generations of actors, musicians, and poets. Their guilds, their competitions, and their patronage systems foreshadowed the institutions of modern entertainment. From music academies to theatre companies, even in folklore and memory, their shadows endured. Villages told stories of wandering minstrels who brought news of distant lands. Families recalled jesters who had dared to mock lords to their faces. Old manuscripts preserved troubadour poems, and readers centuries later still marveled at their delicate beauty. The entertainers had become part of Europe's cultural memory, shaping how people thought about joy, art, and even truth itself. Their greatest legacy, however, was not in institutions or forms, but in the spirit they carried. In an age of hardship, of famine, war, plague, and toil, they reminded people of laughter, of music, of love. They showed that even in darkness, the human spirit sought beauty. That legacy did not die with the Middle Ages. It lived on in every theatre performance. Every song sung to a crowd, every poem whispered to a lover. Thus, when the Renaissance dawned, it did not cast aside the entertainers of the Middle Ages. It carried them forward, transformed and reborn, their echoes alive in new voices, new instruments, new stages. The jester's bells jingled still, though now behind the mask of the clown. The minstrel's harp still sang, though now refined into the lute's delicate strings. The troubadour's verses still soared, though now inscribed in sonnets and printed books. The past had not been erased, it had become the foundation upon which new art could rise. The story of jesters, minstrels, and troubadours is more than a tale of performers who once wandered through castles, courts, and villages. It is the story of humanity's eternal hunger for laughter, music, and poetry. Though centuries have passed, though kingdoms have risen and fallen, though the bells of fools and the harps of minstrels may no longer echo across medieval halls, their spirit endures, alive in every form of entertainment that followed. To speak of them is to speak of the roots of joy itself. Jesters, with their painted faces and jingling caps, taught the world that laughter is not mere frivolity, but a kind of wisdom. Their jokes, sharp as blades, pierced through pride and pretension, reminding both peasants and kings that no man is above mockery. They embodied freedom of speech in an age bound by feudal power, daring to say what others could not. Their legacy lives not only in the clown, the comedian, and the satirist, but also in the very idea that humor can reveal truth. In every modern laugh that carries a sting of wisdom, the jester's voice still rings. Minstrels, strumming their instruments and singing their tales, preserved the memory of a world without books or newspapers. They were the carriers of stories, the keepers of history, the binders of community. Long before printing presses and radios, their songs were the news, the entertainment, the heartbeat of shared culture. Though their wandering craft has faded, their music gave birth to the ballad, the folk song, the traditions of storytelling through melody that still echo in villages, festivals, and modern stages. In every guitar strummed beneath the stars, in every song that tells a story, the minstrel still lives. Troubadours, with their verses of love and longing, transformed human passion into art. They gave voice to the deepest emotions, refining language into poetry, and reshaping the very idea of romance. Their words reached across centuries, inspiring poets, novelists, and lovers who sought to turn desire into beauty. The troubadour-esque legacy is written not only in sonnets and ballads, but in the way we speak of love itself. Even today, when songs of devotion and heartbreak fill the airwaves, we are hearing the distant echo of troubadours who once sang in candlelit courts of Provence. Together, these entertainers carried the soul of the Middle Ages. They were not kings or knights, not priests or scholars, yet they shaped the imagination of Europe. In an age marked by hardship, they brought relief. In a world governed by hierarchy, they bridged the gap between noble and commoner. In times of silence, they filled the air with laughter, song, and poetry. They were the heartbeat of culture, the living proof that art is as essential as bread, as necessary as prayer, as timeless as the human spirit itself. Their story also reminds us that entertainment is never just a distraction. It is a mirror of society, reflecting its joys and sorrows, its fears and hopes. Jesters mirrored authority with satire. Minstrels mirrored history with song. Troubadours mirrored the heart with verse. And in their mirrors, the people of the Middle Ages saw themselves more clearly. So, to do we, when we laugh at comedians, sway to music, or whisper poetry, continue to gaze into the mirrors first polished by these medieval performers. The Middle Ages ended, the Renaissance bloomed, and the modern world was born. Yet the timeless spirit of these entertainers still lingers, in carnivals and theatres, in folk songs and festivals, in poetry and music that touch the heart. They are present. They are the ancestors of our artists, the forefathers of our entertainers, the guardians of joy across the centuries. And so, as the curtain falls on their story, we do not leave them behind. We carry them with us in every moment when laughter breaks silence, when music lifts the soul, when poetry stirs the heart. The jester's bells may no longer jingle in castle halls, but they jingle still in every joke that makes us see truth. The minstrel's harp may be silent, but its strings vibrate still in every melody that tells a tale. The troubadour's voice may be gone, but it sings still in every word of love spoken across time. They remind us that entertainment is not a luxury, but a necessity, a light in the darkness, a song in the silence, a truth in disguise. The Middle Ages gave us many legacies, cathedrals, castles, crusades, but among its greatest gifts are the jesters, minstrels, and troubadours who proved that even in the harshest of times, the human soul will find a way to dance, to laugh, to sing, and to love. Thus, their story is not only the tale of an industry, but of humanity itself. For as long as men and women gather together, as long as voices rise in song, as long as laughter and poetry exist, the spirit of the medieval entertainers will never die.